Now you talk about terror. What about for me? I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
The United States, like many industrialized countries, has undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, cementing into place a system of control the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism. Inverted totalitarianism retains the institutions, symbols, iconography, and language of the old capitalist democracy, but internally corporations have seized all the levers of power to accrue ever greater profits and political control. Claire Provost and Matt Kennard, in their book Silent Coup, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy, chart the way the corporate coup d'etat was orchestrated. It examines the use of an international legal system to control and plunder the resources in the developing world, including the overthrow of governments that challenge corporate dominance. The authors expose the nefarious alliance between nonprofit organizations and corporations, one that prioritizes profit rather than justice. They document the weakening of labor laws and the evisceration of workers' protections and rights. To enforce this predatory behavior, corporations have not only created, in essence, a global Supreme Court, but raised and funded private mercenary militias to crush labor movements and intimidate and even murder activists. The subversion of democracy abroad is accompanied, the authors argue, by the subversion of democracy at home. The mechanisms of control is used to plunder the developing world are also used in the industrial world. Joining me to discuss Silent Coup is Matt Kennard, a former staff reporter for the Financial Times and co-founder and chief investigator at Declassified UK, a news outlet that investigates British foreign policy. Matt, in your first chapter, titled Democracy on Trial, you write about an international legal case that was launched by a Vancouver-based company called Pacific Rim against the government of El Salvador. And you use this case as a kind of template throughout the book for how large corporations loot and pillage developing countries by forcing them to accept international agreements, investment treaties, and what you call corporate courts that favor global corporations. So I want you to explain what happened in El Salvador and how this system works.
Well, I'll start with the system itself and then talk about the El Salvador examples. So, effectively, what the system is a shadow legal system which operates across the world and affects pretty much every country in the world. And what it does is enshrines a system whereby multinational corporations can sue states for enacting policies they don't like, which they say infringe on their quote unquote investor rights. This was a system that was created in the heat of the decolonization movement and the end of formal empire. So the main body where these cases are heard is actually an arm of the World Bank, and it's called the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, ICSID. Very little knowledge about it in the developed world. It's everyone in El Salvador, for example, knows the name of it. It's called CIADI by its Spanish acronym. And when we went to El Salvador, everyone knows that, but that's something we can come back to. So this was created in 1966 by the World Bank. And the 60s obviously was a time when many countries in Africa and other places were getting independence, and a lot of people who had been fighting the imperial powers on the ground were now becoming presidents and prime ministers. Now, in that scenario, the traditional owners of the world were panicking, and they thought, how are we going to maintain control? How are we going to ensure our investments are protected when we don't have formal empire to rely on? We don't have a formal garrison of troops based in that country where we can just take out a leader if he does something we don't like. So they came up with this system, and in fact, it was the brainchild of a German banker called Hermann Abs, who was at Deutsche Bank, and he was actually associated with the Nazi regime as well. But after the Second World War, he thought that the world needed a system that could what he called a capitalist Magna Carta. And he made this famous, it's not a famous speech, it should be a famous speech, but he made this speech in San Francisco in 1957. where to a group of industrialists from all over the world, and all the bigwigs in America were there as well. And he said, "Look, this was in the context was this was 1957, so the context was 4 years before in 1953." MI6 and the CIA had had to take out the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, because he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, what's now BP. The following year, the CIA had to take out the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, because he had the temerity to redistribute a bit of fallow land back to landless peasants. And then in 1956, there was a Suez crisis where President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and there was an invasion by France, the UK, and Israel. And he was saying, look, we're going to keep coming up against this problem. We don't want to have a system where we have to go in hard, overthrow governments, assassinate leaders, whatever it may be. We need a legal system, an infrastructure in place where we can exercise power above the heads of these people. So even if we get a Nasser in power, an Arbenz or a Mohammed Mossadegh, they can't move. So his idea was to say we need a legal system that operates above states. It's a supranational institution where investor rights can be enforced. He then joined with a British lord called Lord Shawcross, who was actually a Labour lord, and they wrote this document called the Abd-Shawcross Draft Convention, and it was it was a template for this system, and it kind of nothing happened until it was taken up by the World Bank in the 60s, and then created as I said, as ICSID in 1966. Now, we went to the World Bank archives as part of the reporting in Washington, D.C., and they were quite open on the inside about what it was about. It was about enshrining corporate power around the world. And also, it was a geopolitical tool during the Cold War because it was a way of enforcing corporate rule in countries that might be at risk of going to communism. But anyway, it kind of didn't take off as a system really until the end of the Cold War. And we mapped out and analyzed the number of cases, and it exploded after the end of the Cold War. And a lot of cases would have been taken against Eastern European countries, actually, because it's a major system that's enforced on countries that are reintegrated into the Western-backed economic system. When a country comes in from the cold, and we went to Myanmar, Burma when it was coming in from the cold, or they thought it was moving towards democracy. This obviously hasn't happened, but at that time they thought it was. And when we were there, ISDS, which is what the system is called, Investor State Dispute Settlement, was a large part of the menu of policies that are pushed on governments that are being reintegrated into this system, because the Western states, the Western corporations know that it's a vital tool for them to use to make sure that new states can't move and can't go against corporate power around the world. So to take this up to El Salvador, so the book started really with this story in El Salvador. We got a call, myself and Claire, I'd previously been at the Financial Times, she'd been at the Guardian, she'd been covering the aid industry and development. And in the Financial Times, I'd been in Washington, so I'd been looking at the World Bank. And we were both talking about, we got this amazing fellowship where the director of the organization, called an amazing American investigative journalist called Gavin McFadden, who was actually a mentor to Julian Assange and Bernie Sanders back in the 60s. But anyway, he said to us, look, you can do whatever you want for 2 years and you have a travel budget. So we thought we should be as ambitious as possible. And we both agreed that from the reporting we'd been doing, and I know you've done a lot of great work on this as well, Chris. We believed that the biggest story in the world today, political story, is the fact that the corporate form, the economic instrument of corporations, has eaten the state that created it. And this has been a battle that's been waged over 400 or more than 400 years, from the first joint stock company, which they say was created in the middle of the 16th century in London. But there's been this battle waged. Anyway, so we decided that was it, and we wanted to think of a way of doing it. And we got a call from an activist actually at that point. And Claire had been doing a bit of work on ISDS, and one of her colleagues or one of her sources said, you should go to El Salvador. They've got this really I say amazing case, amazing in the sense of the resistance to it, because she was saying, look, this isn't like ISDS is one of these sort of arcane, obscure systems that no one knows about and no one talks about. But in El Salvador, everyone knows about it. And everyone knows what ICSID is. It's called CIADI in the Spanish acronym. And she said, you've got to come and talk to the activists. And the government were willing to fight this case, which a lot of governments aren't as well. At the time, it was FMLN in power, the party that came out of the Marxist guerrillas in the 1980s. So we went along, and we saw just what this system means and what this system allows to happen, because the people in El Salvador understood that this was a massive attack on their sovereignty. This mining company had been not being given a permit to dig for gold because it was a massive risk to the local population. Now, you would think that a government, its role and its priority should be to enact policies which are fundamentally protect the security and health of their citizenry. That's what the system is about stopping. So this corporation said, well, you can't revoke our permit, and we're going to take you to ICSID for $300 million. And the government publicized it, and it became this big cause célèbre. Everyone on the ground knew about it. So it was an amazing experience to start. We then went to South Africa for a second case, which was maybe the craziest case of all, which was a case where an Italian granite miners had taken the ANC government and the South African state to ICSID because of black empowerment policies. These were policies which were enacted at the end of apartheid to correct the historical injustice of apartheid, and part of it was to give 30% of every company to historically disadvantaged people, so black people. This Italian company said this is an attack on our investor rights. They took South Africa to court, and in fact, that was settled out of court. And the South African government said you don't have to apply this policy to your company, so they didn't have to apply. And the reason the South Africans did that, we talked to ministers when we went to South Africa, or people who had been ministers at the time, and they said we wanted to keep it as quiet as possible because we didn't want to incentivize other companies to do this, because we knew that they could win, or they could at least take a lot of money from us. So, so actually, it was the opposite in South Africa. When we went to South Africa, no one knew about this case, which was a fundamental attack on the South African government and fundamental attack on post-apartheid policies. Anyway, so it's the book developed out of that. I think that the ISDS system is the emblematic system in the book, because it's impossible to justify. And as you know, Chris, all these systems that enforce corporate rule, that enforce investor rights, that enforce the rule of the 1%, they all have quite sophisticated ideology bolted on top of them to justify them to the general population in as much as they need to do, but also to the people on the inside who don't want to look in the mirror every day and think I'm a monster. ISDS doesn't even have that. It's one of the few systems I've ever come across where people find it very hard to even justify it, because the only justification they say is that it increases the chance that a country will attract foreign investment, because companies won't be scared to go somewhere because they know if something bad happens to them, they'll have recourse to a supranational venue where they can get compensation. But of course, that is completely opposite to what we're told how capitalism works. If you go to the Congo and you open a mine, and you might get huge returns, but yeah, you might get expropriated or get your asset taken by a paramilitary force. But that's part of the risk. This system insures you against that risk and de-risks capitalism for the global corporate transnational class. So it's a huge attack on democracy. And I'll just finish with this. It's not only the cases that reach court that are the problem here. In fact, I think that's actually not even the biggest problem. The problem is the policy chill that effect this has around the world, because a lot of governments now, when they're considering taking policies which might infringe on corporate profits, that this is now getting hit with one of these cases is now a big consideration. We got internal documents, for example, from Guatemala through the Freedom of Information Act there about a mine that they were evaluating whether to grant an environmental permit. And the government were talking on the inside, not about, there were some discussions about the impact this mine would have on the local community, but in the end, they were talking about what kind of problems they'd have at ICSID and whether they get sued by this company if they didn't give the environmental permit. In the end, they gave the environmental permit because it was such too big a risk, and that happens across the board. And it's a real attack on democracy. It's a real attack on the ability on anything any ability of a government to react to its citizenry as it should do ahead of corporate power. And it's not just in the developing world now, it's coming home to roost. We call it the boomerang effect. And in fact, a lot of these systems which were set up to enforce corporate rule during the fall of formal colonialism are now coming back to hit the states that they were created in.
Let's talk about how countries are pressured into, you do in the book, how they're pressured into accepting these agreements, which are, of course, very disadvantageous. And then let's go back to Salvador, because that was one of the few examples where they were successful in fighting back.
Yeah, well, so just as an explanation, this system is enshrined in free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, which are called BITs, and other sort of trade financial agreements or trade agreements between countries. And one of the major revelations I had during the reporting of this book was about free trade agreements, or so-called free trade agreements, because free trade agreements, when you hear that, you think that's about the mutual lowering of tariffs, that's about greasing trade. In fact, that's probably like a page of a free trade agreement. They're hundreds of pages long, and it's about creating all these different mechanisms, legal mechanisms, for which corporations can operate in that country unfettered. And I think that free trade agreements should be called corporate rights agreements, really. And ISDS is enshrined, investor state dispute settlement. This system where multinational corporations can sue states is often enshrined in free trade agreements. So it's in NAFTA, it's in CAFTA. It was going to be in TTIP, which was this touted as the biggest free trade agreement in history between Europe and the United States, which I think has been iced now. But and then there's bilateral investment treaties. So, and often countries don't even know what they're getting into. So in the South Africa case, it was quite interesting. They were talking about the bilateral investment treaties which were used for this by this Italian mining company, and they said these were agreements signed by Mandela after the fall of apartheid, and he'd go to, say, Belgium, and they'd say, "Oh, welcome, you're coming back into the fold now." They'd have a nice dinner, and then say, "Let's just sign this nice little bilateral investment treaty." The imputation being that this meant nothing; it was a bit of diplomatic goodwill. That was the term that was used by people who we talked to, who formerly served in the ANC government. And then 20 years later, they're getting hit with these suits that they didn't even know could be activated through these agreements. And that's often what you see. The whole system is done very secretly. And in fact, when we went to the World Bank, as I said, we went to the archives, but we also were inside the World Bank, and we were talking to people at the different branches. So that the IFC, which we can also talk about, which is a majorly important institution. And we were saying within the World Bank building, we were saying, "Do you know where ICSID is?" And people, even who worked in the World Bank, didn't know what ICSID was. So it's kind of this like bastard child that no one wants to talk about. No one knew about it, which was a revelation, and even less people know about it on the outside. As I say, mainly because it's completely indefensible. But yeah, the whole system is done. That's why I call it a shadow legal system, because it's all very, very secretive, and even the cases themselves, they're not open court. It's very, very hard to get documentation. The system by which arbitrators are chosen is opaque. How the compensation they get, the whole system is just massively secretive. And the problem is, it's often in the interests of the corporation and the state to keep it that way. That's the problem. As I mentioned, the South African government wanted to keep the case really quiet because they don't want to incentivize other companies to do it, because this system effectively allows any company in the world because you can do another thing called jurisdiction shopping. So even if you were based in a country which doesn't have a bilateral investment treaty with the country you want to sue, you just open a shell company in the country that does, and then activate it through that. So you can effectively do it. You can find a way if you need to. And maybe the most corrupting part of the whole system is what's called third-party financing, which is that there's boutique financial firms which invest solely in claims against governments. And they loan to companies, not only to pay for the expenses of the case, but also to expand that. But they say, "We'll loan you this money. You don't have to pay us back if you lose, but if you win, you give us a cut of the award." Now, we're talking often, sometimes about billions of dollars. In the case of Occidental Petroleum, they won billions from Ecuador. There's a case now against Honduras, which is getting some attention in the media, where an American company is taking Honduras to ICSID for $11 billion, which is a third of their GDP. For the current government of Honduras is trying to shut down an SEZ which was opened by the previous US-backed neoliberal regime. They're trying to reverse that, and they're getting hit with this suit. And the Honduran government don't know what to do, because this is such a huge sum of money that it could have huge impact on their whole program and the ability of them to survive. They can't pay it, so it's going to be interesting what happens to that. But it's a massive attack on democracy, and I think that the left which was exercised by some of these sort of what was called the anti-globalization movement in the 90s, but it got derailed a bit by September 11th from the war on terror. But these systems have got only grown in strength, and I think the left needs to re-engage with these issues, and this system needs to be publicized as well as the other systems we talk about in the book.
Let's talk about the case of Salvador, because it's an exceptional case, and mention what the fate of this activist, Marcelo Rivera.
Yeah. So the other point was, as you know, around the world, and this is another thing that's hushed up by the corporate media. There are inspiring activists all over the world fighting back against corporate rule. In the case of El Salvador, there were activists. There was Marcelo Rivera who was killed, but there were many others who were killed, who were fighting mining projects. And it's always the same. It was always the same when we come across it. We talk to people and say, "Yeah, well, we can't prove that it was the mining company because this was someone who goes past on a motorbike, lets out a flurry of bullets, kills this person, and the legal system doesn't really work. There's not the detective system doesn't work, so they don't find who kills them. Everyone assumes it was associated with his activism against the mining company, but it's never proven. In the case, I went to actually to Colombia as well, which is a very interesting case because Chiquita, the banana company, formerly known as United Fruit, changed their name because they overthrew a few too many governments, and it was bad press. But they were actually Chiquita were taken to court in the United States under the Alien Tort Statute over their behavior in Colombia because they'd hired paramilitaries and paid paramilitaries to kill activists and trade unionists who were fighting Chiquita in Colombia. That case, I think, is still going, or I'm not 100% sure, but it was going when I went there. I think it was in 2016. But often that is it's complete impunity, really, because there's enough layers of degree of separation. Like in the case of Rivera, there was no, it was complete impunity. In Honduras, which I mentioned, which we also went to, there were lots of activists against an oligarch called Facuse, who's now died, but he was in the Aguan Valley, and there were lots of activists getting killed who were fighting against his companies and their actions, and a lot of people were getting killed. Nothing ever happened, and actually they got investment from the World Bank. But this is what you see. No one's fighting back against this on the inside because the whole system's set up to promote corporate power. The only people fighting it, and the only people really who understand it and have to understand it, is the people on the ground, because they have no choice to imbibe all these false ideologies which justify it to the people on the inside. They understand what the corporations are doing when their friends are getting killed for just raising a hand of dissent against what they're doing. So yeah, it's a really depressing in that sense, but it's also really optimistic in a sense that there is real activism against a corporate rule, and it does win sometimes. There's the case of Bolivia, which is talked about a lot, but in 2000, the water system in Cochabamba, the third largest city in Bolivia, was privatized and handed over to the American corporation Bechtel, who jacked up prices massively, made it impossible for most people to afford water. They even made collecting rainwater illegal. And then huge amounts of people came out in the streets. 2 weeks later, the government had to reverse it. And then 5 years later, they had actually their first indigenous president, who was a liberation leader, who nationalized countless industries when he got into power, and was later praised by the World Bank and IMF for the economic success under his government. And his government actually did the opposite of everything you're told to do by the IMF and World Bank, which is interesting in its own right. But so, yes, people are working at high risk, but it's inspiring to see their bravery, but also the successes that can be brought about. Because the reason, as I mentioned, that a lot of this is kept undercover is because it's unjustifiable, and it's clearly impossible to justify if you know the facts. And the other problem we have, and what we should focus on in the West, because we have a responsibility in that we have a freedom that these other people don't, and we can say stuff and do activism and raise the alarm with a degree of freedom they don't have. But the media we have, the corporate media, is infested with corporations. They're owned by corporations, but they're also that they do all these advertorials now. There's every part of the media is just infested with corporate power, and so is the NGOs. And we came across this because El Salvador is a good example. Now, this wasn't to do with the ISDS case, but when we went there, we went to a town on the outskirts of San Salvador, the capital, called Nejapa. And Nejapa is a really poor town, but they live on top of an aquifer. And no one there could afford water from the aquifer. But yet down the road, all these multinational companies were bottling the water to make Coke and other things. One of them being SABMiller, which is one of the biggest companies in the world. It bottles Coke. And we did a story for The Guardian. So naturally, in The Guardian, its whole development website is sponsored by the Gates Foundation. So the article went under the Gates Foundation logo. The Gates Foundation is not a benign player in the system. It's one of the major forces for pushing a neoliberal sort of idea of development. But anyway, Sab Miller sent me in that when I went to Sab Miller for comment, as you do, as you do, and they sent me a report. They said, "Look, you got it all wrong. We've done nothing wrong. Look at this report we co-authored with Oxfam." And I sort of couldn't really believe that because Oxfam, I mean, I'm a bit less naive now, but I thought back then I was like, well, Oxfam, they're doing some good in the world. But this report basically exculpated Sab Miller of any wrongdoing in the Hapa, and had the Oxfam America logo. And I just thought that is incredible. And then obviously it goes onto the Guardian website under the Gates Foundation. 2 days later, this was amazing. An interview appears on the Guardian, not an advertorial, not flagged as anything. An interview with the Latin America division head of Sab Miller. Doesn't mention our article, but it's basically him talking about why there's problems with water in Latin America, and it's all about the political corruption. Of course, that's the term du jour of the multinational corporations. They blame the victim. Why are those politicians corrupt? I wonder. Is it anything to do with the corporations themselves? But anyway. And then I sort of thought that is incredible that it wasn't a letter, it was an interview. And then I looked into it and I saw that Sab Miller funded a whole section of the Guardian's website as well. So you see, and I publicized that, and then soon after I was banned from ever writing for the Guardian again. But the problem is that I had a predilection to go against this stuff, but your average reporter who's getting bombarded with all this, with these Oxfam reports, with these officials from Sab Miller that they don't know that the Guardian's funded by Sab Miller. They don't. It's very hard to push back against that, and often nearly no one does. So you see that it's a panorama of control, and it's very, very hard to get the truth out about this corporate system in the corporate media. It's not a coincidence, is it? You wouldn't go to Pravda to get the reality to understand the reality of what the Soviet Union was doing, and you don't go to the corporate media to get the reality of what corporations are up to. So I think, to conclude from this book, I think the responsibility we have is to not play that game, because we have power. We have power in the West because this is where all these systems are operated from. We have power, and we need to use that power to tell the truth, even if it means we get marginalized from the mainstream media, which is a inevitable consequence of doing it.
They were successful in El Salvador in blocking the mining agreement, the activists. One of the very few successes you write about in the book. I want to talk about, we have a couple minutes left, the boomerang effect, because it comes back to haunt us, and you use Germany as an example. Just explain in the last 2 minutes what took place.
Well, in Germany, so Hermann Abs, as I mentioned, was the German banker that was kind of the godfather of this system. And then we went to Hamburg in Germany to look at a case. Well, there was two cases actually. Germany had decommissioned their nuclear power after the Fukushima disaster in Japan because they said it was too dangerous. And this a Swedish company, Vattenfall, who ran nuclear power plants in Germany, took them to these courts for billions. And then there was another case where Vattenfall had a coal-powered power plant in Hamburg as well, which we went to, and they had the waste from the plant was raising the water temperature in the river that ran side it, but also like way far into Hamburg. and they challenged that the environmental permit where they said you've got to keep the river below a certain level. They challenged it, and then the local government basically just said, okay, you can go back to how you wanted it before. So it's a way to strong arm people, and it was amazing talking to people in Hamburg, because actually one of them said to us, I knew about the system before. I was shocked when I realized that we could get hit with this stuff. And that's something we saw all across the world. And we reported a lot in Europe. So, and I'll just finish with a case in Britain recently. A major part of the book is about how corporations have chiseled off physical space from states. That's a whole another topic. But the main one is SE's special economic zones, which are kind of like corporate utopias. You don't have to pay normal tax. You don't have to pay customs duties. You don't have to apply the minimum wage. All these things that corporations, if they designed the world, would this is how it would look. But anyway, Britain now, a couple of years ago, announced that we're going to open 13 free ports. Free port sounds like a nice thing, but a free port is effectively a SEZ, and that's Britain now. So it's the West, the developed world has joined the race to the bottom and is basically finding any way to sell off the few remaining things that it has to corporations, and is basically in Britain, which NHS for many decades was a beacon in the world. People
It's the
looked up
National Health Service.
the National Health Service. Yes, it was created by the Attlee Labour government after the Second World War, free at the point of use. Anyone can use it. And me growing up, I'd go to you never ever were asked about money when you went into a hospital to see the GP. It's amazing. But we're now privatizing the whole of the NHS and making it more and more like the American system, which is the worst in the world in terms of how much it costs to health outcomes. So why are we doing that? We're not doing that because the government's thinking, okay, this is a good idea. We're doing that because government isn't making policies. The corporations are making policies and enforcing them on the government. And there's very, very little pushback against it in Britain, because again, it's all been done by stealth. I went for an X-ray the other day, and it was out in a trailer outside the hospital that was run by G4S and Serco, two companies. Just the whole of the NHS is that our ambulances have G4S logos on now. So stuff you wouldn't have thought would be possible is happening, and they're eating every part of the state, and they've erected the mechanisms to do that internationally, but also, as you know, domestically. I mean, we haven't touched on that, and the book doesn't really touch on that. But domestically, in terms of the United States, particularly, the corporations have just colonized the political system, and it's impossible for most politicians now to get elected without heavy backing from the corporate sector. So that's why we call it silent coup, because in 2023, this is, as I said, this is a war which has been waged for 500 years by the corporation against the state. But effectively, in 2023, they've won, and there's very, very few spaces left that they haven't colonized. And the cultural outgrowth of that as well is that people, I think that the prevalence of conspiracy theories, like Bill Gates is installing chips in people's brain. There's a lot of it around. I don't know I think there is in the United States as well, but I think a lot of it is that people understand that the politicians they're seeing on TV aren't making the decisions. There's no analytical, in the corporate media, there's no analytical framework for them to understand why that is. So you reach for, like, I don't know, individual or a cabal, when in fact the answer for me is corporate power. Has been that is where those politicians aren't making decisions. They're right in that, but the reason the people are corporations, the big ones, and they are in the work I do on a day-to-day level with declassified. I look at a lot of declassified files, British government, and they talk about it so openly. They are talking when the Prime Minister Tony Blair or whoever it is talking to other presidents. He's just talking about big British businesses and how we can help them. I did a story recently about BP in Russia under Putin, and how Blair had sucked up to Putin pretty much solely because he wanted to help BP get into Russia in the early 2000s. And this is a story that is a whole other story. But Putin in 2003 was given a state visit to the UK, the first time since the late 19th century, over 100 years of a Russian head. He came and went round in a horse-drawn carriage with the Queen around London. A couple of days later, BP got the contract to become the biggest foreign investor in Russia's history. And that's how the world works. And you can't talk about it, but we need to talk about it, because otherwise people are going to be reaching for these conspiracy theories, and it's quite scary because mean, you've done a lot of work on this, but if you look at fascism, especially like the Nazi regime, before the Nazis came into power, conspiracy theories were prevalent, and all it took was a demagogue to come along and say it's all the fault of the Jews. It might be some different group next time, but the point is, the level of discourse now is waiting for someone. You've got Trump in the United States. He's a good example, like he uses the confusion, and he uses the inability of people to locate power to enforce a corporate fascistic agenda, really. We haven't quite had it in the UK because we haven't had anyone as charismatic as Trump. We've got Boris Johnson, but he was a bit of a clown. But I do worry, and I think that's why, as I say, just to conclude, that the left needs to re-engage on this issue. And I know you have, and you've been one of the most important journalists really pushing this idea, but it's not something that is widely enough covered, I don't think, by the left media or left intellectuals, because it is, for me, if you cannot understand the world today unless you're looking at it through the lens of corporate power. That is the integral issue, and the fact the state is not operating in the interests of people anymore. And there's no form of democracy because it's been completely destroyed by corporations.
I want to ask you have a section in the book called Corporate Welfare. You did mention Oxfam, but you detail these partnerships between NGOs like Care USA, Save the Children, and these large corporations, Coca-Cola, pharmaceutical giant GSK. Talk about how it works, how these NGOs have been corrupted.
Well, a lot of it is to do with the fact that there's cuts to, and a lot of it picked up after the financial crisis, because governments were cutting back on aid programs and funding places like Oxfam, and Save the Children does get some state funding. And people were donating less. So in that context, they had to survive. They had to look around for other funding models, and corporations are always there because they've got all the money. So corporations got in, and the NGOs often, we talk to countless NGOs about it, and often people on a lower level who weren't making decisions were upset about it, because you don't go into Oxfam, you don't leave university and go into the humanitarian sector or the aid sector to partner with Sab Miller to exculpate them of blame over taking the resources of one of the poorest communities in the world. You don't do that. So they were upset. The higher ups said, we sign these contracts where they have no say over our programs. They have no say over our editorial position in the case of the Guardian and other the media. But it doesn't work like that. Like, maybe they do those contracts. I'm not saying those contracts don't include that, but if it's, the Guardian's a good example. So the Guardian said to us, we make sure that when we partner with a corporation and start publishing corporate propaganda for it, producing and publishing it, we have strict parameters where we say it won't bleed into editorial policy. They have no right for recompense. But 10-20 years down the line, and you've got dozens of corporations all over the website, it has an implicit and subconscious effect on the reporters, because your whole institution is infested with this corporate power, and it operates in a very insidious way. I mentioned the Sab Miller one. That's one of the few cases where it was in my opinion, a very literal relationship between the funding and the ability to barge in on the editorial side of things. But it often operates on a much more insidious role, and it's the same with NGOs. And NGOs are a major, in my opinion, a major thread in this corporate imperial tapestry. They are vital to it because they give the patina of altruism, they give the patina of humanitarianism to this whole system, and that justifies it to the world effectively. And often they're partnering with corporations and enforcing policies, or at least supporting governments which are enforcing policies which promote corporate rule. And the same thing goes for aid, because a lot of these organizations are allied to aid institutions. Like the World Bank is an aid institution. We spent a long time investigating the International Finance Corporation, which was created in 1956, again in the heat of the decolonization movement. And that's the idea of that was let's invest. Let's not just transfer capital to governments. Let's now invest in private corporations to help them go to new markets. The IFC effectively now is just an investment bank. I went to a diamond mine in Tanzania that had been funded by the IFC. Uh, Remember, this is public money. It's our money. The World Bank is publicly funded. So they funded a diamond mine in Tanzania, which hadn't made a profit for 10 years, which is a very nice thing for them to say because you don't make a profit, you don't pay tax. So, and they've got corporate accountants that can do that. And Tanzania's tax ministry is probably like 5 or 6 guys in a room. So, and then we went to a 5-star hotel in Miami, Burma, where which had got funding from the IFC. So it's about enforcing corporate rule under the guise of development, under the guise of humanitarianism, and under the guise of aid. And it's all the opposite of what they say, because the World Bank's stated aim is the alleviation of global poverty, and they're enforcing policies which ensure the majority of humanity continue to live in poverty. And it's not a coincidence we live in the world we live in. That's what they try and tell us is, oh, can't quite work out why it ended up like this, but it's not a coincidence. It's because they've enforced these policies. And if a government goes against them, then they get taken out by the hidden hand, which is the U.S. military, effectively, or at least the NATO intelligence military infrastructure.
You talk about how the role of traditional militaries have been privatized, border control has been privatized, prisons privatized. And I just wondered if you could touch on the consequences of that. And then also, you use the term informal imperialism, if you could address those two issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, we end the book with the privatization of the military and security forces around the world, and in fact, we mention the concept of democracy in the subtitle. And in terms of democracy, maybe this has the biggest ramifications because for centuries, philosophers, sociologists have said that the power of the state rests on the fact that it has the resort to the legitimate use of force, and only the state does. So a police officer can kill someone if they're under threat, but your average Joe can't. Whereas now, there's a whole. We did an analysis actually of the numbers, and in many countries, private security and military was mainly security at this point. But private security outnumbers police now. So what does that mean? And then obviously there's the privatization of the military as well, and that was my first book that I wrote was about the U.S. military, and Donald Rumsfeld made this famous speech at the Pentagon on September 10th, 2001, where he's basically said we need to privatize the DoD's services. It kind of got forgotten after the atrocities of the next day, but the plan was enforced. And in fact, I think in 2007 or 8, there were more private contractors working for the Pentagon than there were DoD personnel. And obviously you got the Wagner Group in Ukraine. This is a major trend, and we're at the start of it as well. You could see, and this sounds like some kind of crazy dystopian ideas, but you could see there's no reason you couldn't see two corporations going to war themselves over resources soon. There's not, because the other thing about this whole system is there's no regulation. There is a informal regulatory framework, but which a lot of corporations sign up to, private security companies, but there's no way to enforce it, and it's kind of like a gentleman's agreement, and that's something actually that the Western countries have, and Russia have colluded on, because they don't want to regulate it, because it gives them one of the major facets of this system for states, and one of the major benefits for them is the lack of accountability. Because it's the plausible deniability. If you get a private company to do it, all the mechanisms where that can be enforced on in the UK, the Ministry of Defence, or in the US, the Department of Defence, they disappear. We can't send Freedom of Information Act requests to private contractors. It's much easier to hush up atrocities. So it's in the interest of states to subcontract this out in terms of accountability. So it's really worrying, and that goes to what you were asking about Rivera in El Salvador. Like, it's much easier to cover up atrocities if corporations are doing them, and if it's outside of the state framework. So yeah, I think that it's going to be a major issue going forward. And also, if you everywhere we went, and it was the book we wrote in sort of chronological order, in that we kind of we started with ISDS, then we went on to aid, then we went on to SEZs. And then when we were looking at SEZs and the chiseling off of physical space, we started understanding that the world that was being created by this corporate system, by this rule of the 1%, was a world of a small elite which was just becoming richer and richer, and then a society on the outside that was becoming more and more desperate, destitute. And in that scenario, you have that 1%, or even less than 1%, has to wall itself off from the rest of that society that it's destroying, and it has to guard that with these private security forces. So it's something. I think it's a symptom of the disease, and the disease is corporate power.
Great. That was Matt Kennard, a former staff reporter for the Financial Times and co-founder and chief investigator at Declassified UK. I want to thank the Real News Network and its production team, Cameron Granadino, Adam Coley, David Hebden, and Kayla Rivera. You can find me at chrishedges.substack.com.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.